In this video, we will talk about the Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS. We will cover what ADFS does and how AuthPoint integrates into the ADFS ecosystem to provide multi-factor authentication, or MFA. At the end of the video, we will discuss how to troubleshoot the ADFS integration as well. Let's get started. ADFS is Microsoft's version of a SAML identity provider, just like AuthPoint is also a SAML identity provider. When ADFS is set up, you can configure any SAML service provider to use the ADFS server for authentication. For more information on these terms and how SAML works, refer to our Integrate AuthPoint with SAML video. One of the big differences between ADFS and other SAML identity providers like AuthPoint is that ADFS runs on a Windows server in your network instead of in the cloud. ADFS is also the only way to configure SAML authentication in Exchange to provide users with single sign-on to OWA. Out of the box, ADFS requires Active Directory passwords, but we can add the AuthPoint ADFS app to protect these logons with MFA. When AuthPoint is integrated with ADFS, all of the SAML service providers will still use ADFS as their identity provider. You will not need to reconfigure them. The AuthPoint ADFS app has a few system requirements. You can only install the app on an ADFS server running Windows Server 2012 R2 or higher, and the server must also have .NET Framework 4.5 or higher installed. You must also have an AuthPoint gateway installed in the network, and the ADFS app must be able to communicate with the gateway. The app uses the gateway to send authentication requests to WatchGuard Cloud. Here is a diagram that shows the ADFS authentication flow with AuthPoint. Step 0 represents the initial configuration when we install the AuthPoint ADFS app on the ADFS server with a configuration file. After the installation, you must also configure the ADFS server to enable AuthPoint. If you have multiple ADFS servers deployed for high availability, there are some additional considerations. For more information on using the ADFS app in an ADFS server farm, refer to our Help Center documentation. In Step 1, the user goes to a SAML service provider and attempts to log in. ADFS does not host an identity provider portal, so all SAML authentications start at the service providers. In Step 2, the service provider redirects the logon request to ADFS in order to authenticate the user. ADFS validates the user's Active Directory password. Then, depending on the ADFS access policy, the server can send the request to AuthPoint via the gateway in Step 3. In Step 4, AuthPoint checks the user's second factor to complete the authentication. The user is then sent back to the service provider that they were trying to log into. Just like with AuthPoint, once the user has logged in once, they will be automatically logged into any other SAML resources. Let's take a look at what's required to integrate AuthPoint with ADFS. Here we are in the WatchGuard Cloud dashboard. We'll start by going to Configure at the top, then AuthPoint. Then we'll go to Resources on the left. We need to configure a new ADFS resource, so we'll select it in the list and then click Add. We only need to configure a resource name and save our resource in order to complete this step. When we create resources, we also need to define how users will authenticate to those resources based on their groups. I have clicked Authentication Policies on the left, which is where we configure these settings. In this account, I only have a single group for my users, and I already have a policy in place that enforces multi-factor authentication for the group. This policy is applied to all resources on the account, so my new resource is already included, and my users are authorized to use it. You can use authentication policies and policy objects to configure the level of access that you need for all of the different users in your environment. For more information about authentication policies and how to configure them, refer to the Using AuthPoint Authentication Policies video. Now we need to add our ADFS resource to a gateway. We clicked on Gateway on the left and we'll edit the existing gateway. In the ADFS section, we'll simply add our resource to pair it to this gateway, and after we save this, the gateway will automatically update with these new settings. Refer to our Using the AuthPoint Gateway video for more information on creating or installing the gateway. On the Downloads page on the left, we can find additional information about the ADFS app, and we can download both the installer and the configuration file. Here we are on a Windows 2016 server with ADFS already in place. We have the ADFS app installer and our configuration file in the same directory. We'll run the installer, and after a short time it will complete. After we have installed the ADFS app, we will need to restart the ADFS service before we will be able to use AuthPoint. Here is the ADFS management snap-in for Windows 2016. In order to enable ADFS to use the AuthPoint app, there are two things that we will need to configure. The first is on the left under Authentication Methods. We need to open multi-factor authentication and enable WatchGuard AuthPoint as an MFA option. The second thing we will need to configure are the ADFS access policies. We can find them by viewing the Relying Party Trusts on the left. Relying parties are like SAML resources in AuthPoint. We will right-click on one in the list and edit its access policy. Just like the access policies in AuthPoint, the policies in ADFS define what the users must provide in order to authenticate to this resource. In this example, we have required all users to provide MFA, but you can be more selective if required. Now that AuthPoint and the ADFS server are configured, we are all set to start using AuthPoint with ADFS. In this environment, we have a Firebox access portal in place, which is using ADFS for authentication over SAML. The access portal is protecting OWA hosted by an internal Exchange server, which is also using ADFS for authentication. So I can log into the access portal by authenticating in ADFS, and then I'll be prompted for my second factor through AuthPoint. In this case, I'll provide a one-time password. Once I'm in the access portal, I can select Outlook Web Access, and since OWA is using SAML and I've already authenticated, I'll be sent directly to my mailbox. When troubleshooting authentication problems with ADFS, it is important to identify if the issue is caused by the ADFS server or AuthPoint, as either one could have valid reasons to deny authentication. Since ADFS handles the logon first, we should check the Windows event logs to understand what happened there. Here are the event logs on this ADFS server, and we can check the security event logs to see logons to ADFS. Here we see a successful user logon with the event ID 4624, and we can also see failed logons with the event ID 4625, which include additional information about what went wrong. If you expand Custom Views and Server Roles on the left, you can find additional logs under Active Directory Federation Services. If everything looks good in the ADFS event logs, then we can check the audit logs in WatchGuard Cloud to understand how AuthPoint handled the logon. Here we can see a failed user authentication in the audit logs, and we can click on it to get more information. In this case, the one-time password was not correct. If we do not see any logs in the audit logs, that may indicate an issue with the ADFS app. If you have a problem installing the ADFS app into the server, you can always generate a log file with additional information. Since the app is a MSI file, we can run MSI exec in a command prompt with the following arguments to output any log information generated from the installation process. The ADFS app runs internally inside ADFS. There is not a service for the app. However, the app must be able to communicate through the AuthPoint gateway, so if the app doesn't seem to be working, check the services for the AuthPoint gateway and verify they are running. In order to troubleshoot further, we can check the ADFS app logs and the AuthPoint gateway logs as well. The app stores a log file on the ADFS server under C, Program Files, WatchGuard, AuthPoint ADFS Client, then Logs, and this will contain information on connectivity and the user authentications. The AuthPoint gateway also has an ADFS log file located with the rest of the gateway logs at C, Program Data, WatchGuard, AuthPoint, and then Logs. But the gateway log file usually contains less detailed information about the ADFS connections and authentications. That will do it for ADFS. We discussed how ADFS is a SAML identity provider and how AuthPoint can integrate into ADFS to provide MFA to the logons. We showed a logon to OWA using AuthPoint, and we covered how to troubleshoot this integration when things aren't working.